Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening.
Hey there. So it is April, which means it is Autism Awareness / Autism Acceptance Month. And we're going to be doing a series around here on unpacking what is autism. We want to issue a pretty big disclaimer here. We're using the DSM-5 criteria as a framework for this conversation. And this is not our endorsement of the DSM. There have been a lot of very thoughtful critiques of the DSM in the last several years. And more specifically, how autism is presented in the DSM is very deficit-based. So we are not in alignment with that view, but we did use that as a framework to walk through our experience of autism and to unpack the many ways that those criteria could show up in a person. The reason we chose to do this is that we do believe in the power of transparency and demystifying the process of diagnosis. The process of an autism diagnosis has historically been very obscure and hard to understand. And so this is our effort for those who perhaps are interested in pursuing a diagnosis or who have gone through the process and want to understand it better. This is our attempt to help demystify that experience. It is not our endorsement of the DSM. Thank you for understanding that.
Hey everyone. So Megan and I are wrapping up our Autism 101 What is Autism series that we've been doing as we've gone through the DSM, and we've kind of broken things down criteria by criteria. We have gotten a lot of feedback that these episodes have been really helpful, and I think we're also going to do an ADHD series next. So thank you for the feedback. Today we are wrapping up with special interests, and we are also wrapping up with what did you just say?
Ooh, that's interesting that you forgot that one. Okay, I won't analyze you. Too early in the morning for that. Sensory.
That's right. Sorry. Brain is scattered, getting ready to leave the country on Friday.
Or maybe you just don't want to think about sensory.
I never want to think about sensory.
Exactly. It's obnoxious.
Dissociation by default. So we're going to talk about those two things today and wrap up the rest of this criteria. And if you have questions about any of these things in these episodes, post them to our Instagram or send us an email, and we will happily try to do some follow-up on this stuff too, because I think that these resources are really helpful as we're kind of in the thick and midst of Autism Acceptance Month, because it's the middle of April right now. So Megan, do you want to take it away from the diagnostic portion of this? Which is always when I'm going to defer to you.
Sure. Yeah. And we have a whole other episode on special interests. So we can also maybe direct people to that as well. But so this is also one where I think there's a lot of cultural misunderstanding about this. You know, if we think about shows like Atypical and that really stereotypical presentation of autism, like I think Penguins is his special interest in Atypical. So they're often presented as these really bizarre, irrelevant special interests.
Right.
In the DSM, it says, I don't have the exact wording, but it's like either kind of atypical or intensity. And I think that's the part that gets missed a lot, is there's a lot of us who have like social justice is a special interest, or reading can be a special interest, but no one's going to be like, let's get this kid assessed for autism because they read too much. Like, that's just not, it's socially desired behavior.
And that I'm so happy you named that and shared that example, because that was kind of my childhood, was that I was so immersed in reading and like kept getting bumped up grades for reading comprehension. And that's something my parents would say today, present day, like, we never thought to get you assessed for autism because you were reading all the time. You were a super smart kid, which is just unbelievably flawed and ableist as it is. But like, it was the reality of like, oh, this is a healthy habit. But if you're looking at intensity, right, that's a really big portion of this.
Absolutely. Yeah. The intensity, and also like why is the person doing that? So part of special interest is they have a really strong self-soothing aspect to it. So like, is the person doing this to block kind of negative emotions or negative thoughts? Is this what they do to soothe? If they don't have access to this, do they become pretty dysregulated? Are they often either trying to gear conversations to their interest, or like that manager who's like, okay, don't bring it back to books, don't bring it back to books, right? That either you're working hard not to always bring it back to your interest, or you tend to like gear conversations to your interests.
Think about how much mental energy that takes to like have that narrative too. Don't bring it back to books. Don't bring it back to books. Try to insert something else that you are interested in, or feign interest in something to like fit in, so that you don't get like picked on, or someone doesn't say, all you talk about is reading, or all you do is A, B, and C.
Well, and for a lot of us, right now, it's all you talk about is autism. Like
Right.
it's mellowed out because I'm almost like 4 years in, but the last few years, my kids are like, they did a funny like meme of like a meme of of our typical family conversation for us. And when they imitated me, it's like, oh, and this connects to neurodivergence and autism. And it's like, I just kept anything that came up, I would associate it to autism. And I talked about this in the special interest episode, but it's because it was the lens I saw everything through. So for me to meaningfully take something in, like if my spouse is talking about soccer, if I can somehow connect it to autism, that means, or my special interest, that means I can remember and I can appreciate what he's saying to me. And so that tendency to just like when you're taking in new information, you kind of anchor it on whatever your framework is, which typically, at least in my experience, is special interest.
Sorry, dog just walked in and that's going to bother me. Yeah, and I think that's such a wonderful recognition of how that allows for you to then join in on that world and conversation, and have that ability to be social and connected, because it does allow you to focus more on that. And I think when we talk about special interest, it can feel like really all or nothing in a lot of ways too. And we've kind of talked about all or nothing and black and white, and um, thinking patterns in general. And I think that was the one that we could not really figure out like the mechanism or usefulness in a lot of ways in terms of how does this actually like help us in certain situations. But special interest wise, it makes a lot of sense. And I think this is why people get so confused when like autistic people are so immersed in like shows, movies, uh, literature, etc. And if there's a character that dies, if there's a show that comes to an end, if there's a movie that just, isn't going to be created, or a sequel isn't going to come out, like that can really actually have a massive emotional impact for us, because we are so invested in our special interest. It becomes a part of our world. And the soothing piece is really the piece I think that gets missed a lot too, or misunderstood.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That soothing piece of like, there's a reason that we're talking about this or thinking about it so much. It's anchoring, it's grounding. Yeah. Yeah. One thing I thought of when you were saying that, so this, like in one of my children, right, when they were younger, some shows, some like popular kid shows became a special interest. And that doesn't look atypical, right? Like it's common for a kid to be really into Paw Patrol or whatever it was. But what was different was then they were like, I want to redesign my whole room that way. I want to play this character. When I play with my friends, I want to play the show. It's the pervasiveness of it. That's what's different. And I think so again, from an assessment perspective, if it's like, oh cool, you're into like psychology and understanding humans and books, and you like this K-pop band, like that all sounds pretty typical. So you have to look at like, how many posters do you have in your room? Like how much do you know about this band? How many concerts, well, I don't know about concerts for us, but like you have to dig deeper of what is the intensity of this hobby or this passion or this interest.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I'm glad you brought up assessments because I think this gives us some space to talk about like how can you build in to your assessment process for those of you who are listening who are either clinical or medical providers, space for special interest. And the fact that you're mentioning intensity and you're talking about frequency and you're talking about it goes a lot deeper than just surface level. Like, what do you do for fun? Or like, what's your hobby? Or like, what's your favorite book? If I said to you, my favorite book is The Lord of the Rings, and you're like, oh, cool, that's great. I like it too. And we moved on. Would you know that I read the book like 200 times? Like, would you know that I have like Lord of the Rings stuff all over my room? That it's like a coping skill when I'm really feeling burnt out? Like, we would miss a lot of that if we just kind of took that at face value.
And this is why I love the MGDOS. So again, for those who do assessors or for those who are like, what should I be looking at when someone's like, this is what's on the assessment battery? I really love the MGDOS because it leads with interests and passions. And I like it for so many reasons. One, because it really centers that aspect of it. But two, by kind of starting the assessment interest forward, it makes it a much warmer experience than like, let's talk about all the things that are hard for you. It's like, let's start by talking about
Yeah.
your interests and your passions. So especially for those who are looking to incorporate more affirming assessments, I highly recommend looking into the MGDOS too. I love that as an assessment.
That's a great point too. When we're thinking about assessment, and like if we're approaching it from an interests and strengths based perspective, it's a hell of a lot easier to feel comfortable in that environment when you're there for a testing evaluation or an assessment instead of going in with like really an intensified level of anxiety and dread. Um, because it's really easy to kind of get into that mindset of like, this is a very sterile clinical environment. Of course, I'm going to answer questions a certain specific way. And that can really lead to a lot of missed diagnosis as well.
This is kind of tangent. I never say that word, but I love the word
Tangential.
tangent. Yes, thank you. But I'm reading Adam Grant's new book right now, like Unlocking Hidden Potential. And he's not even talking about neurodivergence. It's interesting. He talks so much about divergent thinking, but he doesn't talk about neurodivergence. I want to be like, Adam Grant, like connect these things, please. I would love to hear you talk about it. Anyways, he is talking about he talks about interview processes, and there's actually someone who started a call center for disabled people. And I don't know if this person had autism in mind when they did this, but they restructured the interview process. So the interview process for people who have any kind of stigma, the stress of the interview process goes way up, because of the fear of like, if there's any kind of stereotype of that person, whether it's a disability, whether it's a racial stereotype, that person's stress in an interview tends to go up. And we don't see people's potential when they're under stress, and our working memory goes like way down. So this one person, how he reinvented the interview was he flipped it, and he started with talk about your passions and your interests. Like that's the first, and I think that was actually in paperwork before the interview. And then when you come in for the interview, it's like you can bring a support person or a support animal. You come in and they're like hosting you versus interrogating you. But I loved that idea of, if you're in a position of interviewing someone, have them start talking about their passions and their interests. You're going to learn so much about them, I think, for anyone, but especially for autistic people, that's going to open us up in an interview setting so much more than like, tell me about your strengths and your weaknesses.
Yes. Like, what is your 5-year plan? Tell me about what yeah, exactly. I love that perspective. I think I'm going to adopt some of that for interviewing some new clinicians. So thank you for sharing that.
You're so welcome.
So, in terms of when we're looking at special interest diagnostically, you're mentioning intensity, you're mentioning frequency, you're mentioning the self soothing aspect. What else should we be looking for?
The other thing is it can sometimes be like atypical for age development. So that could be an adult who's still really into like stuffies or like things that we would think are younger, or it could be a kid really interested in pretty advanced things. Like for me, I've talked about this before, I know, but when I was 15, one of my special interests became Mine have often been very justice oriented. So the child sex trafficking industry in Thailand. And so I was like a 15-year-old, and anyone who would listen to me, I'd be like, you have to hear what is happening to these children in Thailand. And I would like go on a monologue. That's not what a lot of 15-year-olds are talking about.
Sure.
Turns out. So there can be that kind of age piece as well. That's another aspect of it.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think that's a good way to kind of to take a step back and look at things from that lens of like, okay, where are we in terms of age range, and what feels like age era appropriate to what should 15-year-olds be into? And it's really interesting to think about it that way. And I'm sure that like that was on the forefront of your mind pretty regularly during that time period. And I'm sure you did a lot of research around it, and you were just like, there was a lot more than just like a concept. So I think that's also important to notate.
Absolutely. Like when I was in college, whenever I'd be assigned a paper, I'd wrap it into that. So if I was in an econ, then I would study the economics of the sex industry. If I was in a sociology class, I would study kind of some of the social pieces that contributed to it. If I was in a religion class, I was studying Buddhism and like how that factors into it. And from a learning perspective, it's great. It meant I was engaged in all these papers because I centered my interest. And I also had a really like deep understanding of all the systemic pieces that played a part of it. But you're just seeing that in each individual class. So you're not like, someone's not seeing that like every single paper I write in college is centering this one thing. And then in seminary, it became African theology. That was the thing that I would every time I could center a paper on that, it would be that thing. But yeah. One thing I also want to add, so this one thing, back when I was doing assessments, one thing that I found was kind of tricky is if someone's ADHD dominant, this is a little bit harder to find. And so ADHD passions and autistic special interest in general, I think those are hard to tease out because they're both have a lot of intensity. One thing I have noticed is that with ADHD dominant folks, they'll like cycle through their interests a bit more quickly, and sometimes won't have that like really enduring interest. And so I've just, that's a tricky point I have experienced as an assessor in the past.
Yeah, I'm glad you named that. That makes a lot of sense too. And it's so hard in assessment sometimes because you have such a brief window and snapshot, and you don't really get to see the timeline or the variation that comes with levels of intensity, especially if they're at peak intensity level when they're coming into your office.
Absolutely. Ooh, I had another thought, and then I promise we can move on. One thing I also noticed was identity theories. And this was especially, I noticed this most with like both queer and BIPOC folks, is that sometimes someone would get really into queer theory or Black studies, and the intensity of it, that was also tricky because the intensity of it makes sense if you have a marginalized identity and now there's this wealth of wisdom you're drawing from. Intensity around that makes a lot of sense, but there are times where that was the special interest, and that's another one that's easy to miss because the intensity makes sense. And so there's again a lot more digging of like, okay, how is this functioning in the person's life for us to understand like if this is a special interest or if this is part of the like social experience around having that identity.
It's a great point. There's so much nuance to this. I think that's a big piece of this too. And I agree. I just want to like circle back to your statement about the MGDAS being really a supportive tool, because I think if we can lead from an example of like curiosity, really supporting someone in terms of sharing that part of themselves, it really gives us a really good glimpse into their inner world, opposed to like, here, fill out this stuff, like answer these yes or no questions, or like respond with whatever immediately comes to mind. And you kind of get frozen in that sometimes. At least I do.
Yeah, exactly. this is kind of nerdy, but like the MGDOS is more of a qualitative assessment. If you think about the quantitative research and qualitative, like qualitative really sticks with story. It stays very close to people's experiences. And then you look for themes within that, whereas quantitative is more of like numbers based and like fill out these metrics. And the MGDOS is a very like qualitative assessment in that sense. And
Yep.
that's one of the things I really like about it. It takes a really long time to complete. But it is so rich. It has taken off in popularity, and I hope to continue to see that. I think I much prefer it to the ADOS. And I know there's some people who will like pull some parts of the ADOS and pull some parts of the MGDOS, because sometimes you do need some of that. Like you also need the quantitative aspects in an assessment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Norms, the numbers, that all matters too.
My favorite part of all of this autistic experience is what we're going to talk about next, which is sensory. And
Yeah.
for those of you listening and having, struggle with picking up on sarcasm, I'm being very sarcastic. I think this is my absolute least part of my own experience, at least, is my sensory system.
For sure. Me too. Hands down. Like easy. Yeah. I've perhaps said it on here before, but I think I said it. Well, it's not been aired yet. I have said this before, or people will hear this again. But in self-care for autistic people, one of the things I say that I've gotten a lot of feedback around is that the hardest part of being autistic is not the social stuff, but my relationship to my body. And a lot of that is the sensory stuff.
Yeah.
This is where I do wish, like, I obviously am affirming of my autistic identity. I think you've said this, like, autistic body, 1-star review, would not recommend. Like, I'd love to actually have a hoodie like that, where it's like I get to grieve the hard part of having this body. Because yeah, 1-star review. I do not recommend autistic sensory experiences.
I mean, we've talked about making merch, so we can use that line. I mean, it feels accurate, right? Like, I would give it less than 1 star, honestly, if I can rank it 0 stars, half a star. You mentioned a couple, like, I don't remember what episode it was in. I think it was when we were talking about our college experiences, and you mentioned like the soul longs for connection, the body yearns for isolation, or something to that extent. That post, that video clip also went super viral. Didn't ever tell you that, but here we are. But it was mainly because so many people were like, that's it. Like, that pinpoints the autistic experience for me. And you're right. The social challenges that I face, I can navigate. It is the pure, like, sensory hell that is so hard. And for me, this is like minute by minute. And there's often such a hyper, like, intense awareness of how uncomfortable I am. And I'm constantly thinking of like how to distract, numb, run away from, dissociate, whatever, to manage my sensory system.
Patrick, do you feel that? I mean, that sounds excruciating. And I'm curious, do you feel that when you have complete control of your sensory environment? Like, is that still, like, you're in your space right now, is that still there? Or are you talking about in the moments where you don't have control of your sensory environment?
It's a great question. Moments where I don't have control, then it's, I mean, then it's like 100 out of 100, right? Moments when I do have control, it's still there, but it's not as debilitating. It's a little easier for me to like move through instead of letting it like consume. And for me to have complete control, I need it to be dark. I need it to be quiet. I need it to be cool. I need to not have a lot of like screen time, I need to not have a lot of stimulation. I probably need to be in movement in some way. There's so much that goes into like the regulation and the actual feelings of being quote unquote comfortable.
Hmm. Like in this moment right now, I'm pretty comfortable. I've got my pressure on my head from my hat. I've got the Is This Autism book on my lap, which is giving me weight. I'm swaying in my chair. The lighting is to a degree I am comfortable with. So in this moment, I'm comfortable in my body for the most part. Are
Yeah.
you in this moment uncomfortable?
No, I actually feel pretty comfortable. I'm like swaying back and forth in my chair because it's a rocker. I have a fidget in my hand. My dogs are sleeping. The lighting feels like where I want it to be. The temperature, because I have the air conditioning on because it's like 85 degrees out here. Um, so all of those things have to happen though to create that like perfect recipe for comfort.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
littlest variation though can throw that
Yeah.
into such a like a loop.
Right. This is why like leaving the house for me gets a 1-star review. Just don't do it.
Right.
Um, yeah, no, something has to be like really, really either high value or high motivation to get me to leave the house. The things that got me to leave the house this year was I needed sunshine. So I went to California twice.
Right.
And that was like, I was desperate. Like,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, but I think it is because it is so uncomfortable. So even like taking the dogs on a walk, I like it because there's some nice nature, but like if we pass another dog, the sensory of like managing my dogs
Yeah.
versus person, like, so even that, I mean, it's a mixed bag 'cause the nature is very connecting, but yeah, sensory stuff. Okay, diagnostically though. So this is one of the most recent pieces to be added. I'm so glad they added it. But it is also really it can also be complicated because for some autistic people, it shows up as like under responsivity. So it takes more stimulus to even perceive the thing, be it touch, smell, taste, sound. For other autistic people like you and I, there's a lot of overreactivity, meaning the slightest smell, like for me, I can tell when something's been like I remember going to my therapist's office once, and I was like, "Oh, did cleaning happen recently?"
Yep.
And he was like, "No." And then he thought about it. He's like, "Oh, over the weekend, I think the cleaners were in here."
Yep.
And it's like the smallest thing will register. And then, right, in one sensory system, we might be under responsive. In another sensory system, we could be over responsive. So this is also can be difficult to detect because it can be all over the place. What's consistent is just like atypical sensory processing.
Right. Yeah. Yep. The over responsivity is so challenging. Um, my sense of smell is just outrageous, and it it is like the littlest variation from homeostasis slash baseline creates such a fallout. And it's one of those situations, right, where like rationally and logically, you can go into this place where you are like trying to convince your brain not to react the way that everything is reacting. Like, this shouldn't be such a big deal. Don't let this impact you so much. Like, it's just a smell. But in reality, like, I can actually feel and experience physical pain when I
Oh, for
am
sure.
smelling something that is not pleasant, or it's too strong, or it's just constantly when I'm constantly aware of it. And it's so hard.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, it's mostly chemicals. So I've had this like working theory. I need to come up with a good metaphor for it. But this working theory of like, I kind of want to make a children's book out of it. But this idea that we autistic people are like the litmus test for humanity. Like we're the signals of like when humanity's gone awry, right? So like I notice a lot of us, especially around chemicals, have really sensitive responses. Like
Yeah.
things that are not good for humanity, that are not good for the planet. A lot of us have systems that respond to that. And I feel like we like serve this sacrificial role. Look at me, I mean, so martyrdom, of signaling like, hey, humanity, this isn't good for us.
Right.
And because we have these responses to things that frankly are not good for humanity, and we have them with much more intensity.
It's a great point. And I think, for those of you who are listening who don't get to work from home and have more control over your environment, talk about how challenging that is, right? Like you go into an office setting where you don't have control over the environment a lot of the time, and other coworkers and colognes, perfumes, deodorants, lack of deodorants, temperatures, lighting, all of the things, especially if you're not working in a place that is neuro-inclusive and affirming to neurodivergent needs. It's a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think this is probably one of the biggest barriers to employment for a lot of us is the sensory stuff. I actually just over the weekend read The Neurodiversity Edge, which is a fantastic book for anyone interested in like workplace inclusion. But it was encouraging to see like the number of remote workers has gone like up so significantly since 2020, which I think is making work so much more accessible for autistic people because we're able, like more of us are able to find remote work where we can have control of our sensory environment and work. And I hope that trend increases. Obviously not all jobs can be remote, but I hope that trend increases because I mean, yeah, that's been such a huge difference for me is working for myself and from my own environment. The hospital setting was just, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So sickening, like physically.
Yeah, I was sick all the time, right? And thinking back, we've done episodes on chronic illness and health conditions and all the ways our immune systems are more susceptible and compromised. I just think back to how often I was sick being in those spaces. Like, granted, working in a 24-hour crisis unit is not healthy for anybody, but it was just like I couldn't go a month without getting sick. I couldn't go a month without having some sort of flare up or issue. And I'm so grateful to be able to have significantly more control over my day to day because of that.
So I'm not sure how we should approach this chapter. Like, should we go system by system of sensory stuff, or should we be more broad strokes?
For the purpose of this series, let's go system by system because we've done episodes on sensory stuff. We've done episodes on meltdowns, shutdowns. We've done episodes on sensory systems. So this is a topic we will revisit infinitely.
Okay. Yes. So hearing, right? That's one of our systems. And again, that could be low registry or high registry. I feel like I notice more high registry around hearing. And it's also one thing this is so funny. There's a funny meme about like how terrible autism assessment questions are, but there's one question that is like, do you hear things that other people don't hear? And someone did a meme of this on Instagram of like, well, how would I know? Which is such a great question. Like, how would you know if you hear something that other people don't? And also that question can also be used as a question for psychosis. Like it depends on the context. But so like electrical sounds. So I have pretty sensitive hearing, but one of my children, like we got Segways a few years ago, and they were hearing a really high pitched sound from it that I wasn't hearing. And it was before we had autism on our radar. And I hate this, but my first instinct was like, no, there's not a sound. Like I don't know that I said that, but that was in my head.
Sure.
And then I realized like, no, they're experiencing a sound that I'm not registering. But that happens a lot, especially, or like hearing the buzzing of even if like toasters are plugged in that other people aren't hearing. But there's a lot of invalidation around sensory experiences that happen because other people would be like, there's no sound, or you're overreacting. Whereas for the person, they're legitimately hearing a high pitched frequency that other people are not picking up.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of hearing, as my Shih Tzu starts barking, yeah, that and thinking about like, if we struggle so much with sleep, right? And sleep deprivation, and you finally fall asleep, but you are more susceptible to hearing sounds in your house or sounds in any device in your home. That's going to continuously bother you, right? Like you're going to keep waking up. You're going to be like, does anyone else hear that? Like, why is this not bothering you? I also just struggle majorly with like very loud environments with varying degrees of volume from like different conversations, music playing, um, maybe different sounds of things happening, fire, like sirens and EMS stuff. Oh,
I'm fogging out just hearing you list all these things. Yeah,
oh my
it's
God.
terrible. It's so
Awful.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons crowds are really hard for me is the sound. I have
Yep.
found loops have helped me like so I mean I've talked about this before, but I respond by dissociating. And I've found if I'm wearing loops, I can stay like 10% longer before I start dissociating.
Yep.
Because yeah, the sounds are just so overwhelming. But at the same time, I love to put on headphones and listen to like loud, intense music on repeat. And so it's not to say if someone sounds sensitive that all sound, right? Like that's in my
Right.
control. I listen to the song on repeat, so my brain's knowing what to expect. Um, so there can also be elements of sensory seeking and sensory avoidance within the same sensory system. So like for me, I have both sensory avoidance and sensory seeking regarding sound.
Yep.
I use sound a lot as a stim.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think there's one thing that happens to me is that as I'm experiencing more sensory overwhelm and my executive functioning takes a hit, everything gets louder. And that can mean like you're in a room and the opening and closing of the refrigerator door gets louder. The putting a glass on a counter, the like small talk that I couldn't hear earlier. And all of a sudden, it feels like you are in a room with 1,000 people. And it's just so overwhelming. And I just noticed like my irritability goes way up. And I am now all of a sudden like very inside of my head and very aware of my surroundings where I maybe wasn't before. And it's also not an enjoyable experience.
Yeah, leaving the house.
Yep.
And start over.
Yeah, that.
Okay, touch. So this is right, this can include how people touch you. This can also include like the textures. So yes, touch. This is another like a common assessment question, which I think is just funny. Like, do you like hard or firm touch? I mean, I guess maybe I have actually asked some people this where they prefer light touch. For the life of me, I can't understand why anyone would say they like light touch. That like it makes me I have a visceral response to even thinking about light touch. It's so weird to me. Like, who's like, yes, I love a light caress on my arm.
Yeah. I love just like that gentle tickle on my neck. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I'm with you on that.
This could show up in our clothes a lot. So like, cutting tags out. And this is also interesting. Again, back when I was doing assessments, sometimes people are like, no, I don't really have sensitivities. And then I'll be like, well, do you cut out your tags? Tell me about your clothes. And they'll list like, 10 accommodations they're already doing. And so they don't perceive themselves as having sensitivities because they've self-accommodated.
Right.
I know for me, like combination of constriction. So I wear a lot of like constriction underclothes. And then soft. So I wear some sort of sweat material almost every day. And that came after my diagnosis. Before I wore like pencil skirts and like nylons and so much uncomfortable shit. And that's made a huge difference just to be able to actually feel comfortable in my clothes.
Makes a massive difference. And I think for me, I wear a lot of like athletic, sportier stuff in general. So soccer jersey stuff that I have, like soccer shorts, like lots of soft materials. And you buy these shirts that can feel like almost like cardboard or like they're so uncomfortable to even touch. So just really allowing myself to have that permission to just be like, I'm going to dress however I want to dress. And throwing out the label of like, or the thought process of, but I have to be professional in setting A, B, C, and D. And it's like, I would much rather be comfortable over quote unquote professional any day of the week. There's an argument in my Facebook group a couple of weeks ago about like, what do you let your clinicians wear to work? Like, does anyone care? Does anyone let their clinicians wear shorts? I'm like, one, who the fuck cares about this? And two, yes, like if I can't be comfortable in my clothing, how can I possibly be focused on anything that's happening around me at any given time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I talk about clothing as like our second skin, like, and I treat mine that way. Yeah. I don't really want to go too much into this. I know people have asked us to do an episode on sex, and if we do, I don't want to draw from lived experience. That feels way too intimate.
For sure.
But I will, maybe we'll bring in like a sex expert and they can talk about it. Touch is like, it is a huge part of intimacy. And I think this is an area that a lot of people who are in any sort of partnership can struggle with. And it requires so much communication around what kind of touch feels good, where does it feel good. And so I think this can absolutely complicate intimacy as well. And I don't think it's talked about enough. Partly because it's hard to talk about. And it can also bring on shame if it's like, yeah, I mean, again, don't necessarily want to go down that trail today, but
sure.
just
I think it's a topic we should have, and we should bring in a sex expert. And I think you're right, though. It does create complication, especially in partnerships where there are different neurotypes involved too, and different sensory struggles. And I think that can create a lot of conflict in communication and also in connection. So
yeah. I said we're going to go down here, and here I go. So there's an overlap between autistic culture and kink culture, and I actually think part of it, I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think part of it has to do with touch. I think some of kink culture creates a container for how to make touch like more tolerable.
Yeah.
And there's also like sensory seeking aspects of kink culture, but I think that there's something about creating kind of a container around touch that kink culture does well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And
oh yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick, I also think like just the simple act of like, and this can also circle back to like social norms and expectations, hugging when you meet someone, like
oh my God,
handshaking, like stuff that I'm constantly cringing at, and I'm always trying to figure out how to navigate. It's not just about the social component, it is literally about the touch component. So it's so hard to navigate that in environments where someone is like actively reaching out and you're like, oh.
As someone who presents like as a woman, like I get so much of that, and it's, oh my goodness. Like I will like try to like pick up my dog or pick up like a handful of books. Like I will literally intentionally think through like, okay, I haven't seen this person in a while. They're probably going to reach for a hug. So how can I just pick up a bunch of random stuff that makes a hug impossible? Like, and I'll literally ruminate about it for like 10 minutes, like for a long time before I even see the person, of just how can I get out of this 5-second interaction?
Yeah, totally. Yep.
Yeah. Unwanted hugs. Don't do it. 1-star review. We're starting a whole collection of hoodies here. Okay. I think I'm getting uncomfortable. So let's talk about vision. This is an interesting one. This because they're like some of the stereotypical things are very like visual seeking. So like you know, watching a fan on repeat, like there's a lot of visual stims.
Right.
I know water is a visual soother for a lot of us. I'm very sensory avoidant, which is so unfortunate for my ADHD, which it makes a mess of everything. So I live with a lot of visual clutter, which is hard for my visual system because I'm easily visually overwhelmed. Like I've mentioned this before too, but like even stripes will make my eyes go wonky and I'll get a headache. So patterns, lighting, visual clutter, all of the above. Very, very sensitive too.
Yep. Clutter for sure. That for me is up there with smell. I do, yeah. Clutter for sure. Patterns not so much. But yeah, I do have to be really aware of stuff like that too in certain environments. And my, like, again, I've talked about this before, but my office that I'm in versus my wife's craft room, 0 out of 10. Do not recommend. It's actually a lot better right now than it usually is. I'll give her credit, but like, whew. So that can be really challenging too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It can be so interesting to see how this plays out. Like I've got one child who's a visual seeker and like likes visual stimulus, and one who's a visual avoider. So like one of their rooms is so sparse, and the other one, it's like we got LED lights in there. We like it's so alive visually. And so it's just so interesting to see how these, especially when you've got polar opposites in the same family, how this could show up.
For sure. Yep. And I keep thinking about this because I've been doing a lot of talks on neurodivergent affirming practices, but like visually in your room, in your office setting, and this is also smell related. I should have talked about this too. That's why we say don't light candles, don't use chemicals, like use really dim lighting. Do not use LED overhead lighting. Like, so I think these are the little things that we can do to create more of an inclusive environment too. And it doesn't take a lot of effort or energy to kind of put those mechanisms in place.
And I think the big thing, the thing I've been hearing more about is like creating flexible environments. So you want to create an environment that's flexible enough that, so having like a couple lighting options, you might have an overhead light, you might have, if possible, natural light, you could have lamps, like, so creating environments that are just flexible enough that they can be tweaked, since you will be working with a lot of clients with different sensory profiles.
And just asking
like
too.
And
ask for preferences.
Asking. Exactly. Yeah. Taste. That's another big one. Like, I mean, this hasn't aired yet, but we have an episode coming out on where we touch on ARPid, and eating disorders. But yeah, taste is a huge one, which is part of what can lead to that restricted diet.
Yeah.
Is that there's just, and that, again, this can be all over the range. Like for me, I love spicy food. So I'm a sensory seeker. I'm a gustatory sensory seeker. Whereas for some people, it's like the faintest spice, it's like, oh, that's way too spicy. So again, we can have really different reactions to flavors and tastes, and texture is also a part of that. Like,
I love that you keep bringing up the fact that there can be opposite ends of these extremes, because I think we so often think about things as like this one-sided situation. Like, so that's a perfect example between spicy food versus like, oh, that's way too spicy. Like, so thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah,
I also love spicy.
The polar is so important with especially this criteria. Because otherwise some people can be missed for sure.
Yeah.
I feel like taste is pretty, self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Smell, we already kind of talked on that, but again, some people are sensory seekers here, right? So they like another, I think this is more on the children's assessments. It'll be like, does your child go up and like smell people? Like that will be their way of orienting to new objects, is to smell them.
Yep.
So, and actually as a kid, I was sensory seeking. Like I loved gas stations. I loved the smell of gas. I loved the smell of cigarettes. Like now oh my goodness, that stuff would make me feel nauseated. But, and that's also, right, that can also happen where someone can transition from being sensory seeking to sensory avoidant. Like these things ebb and flow throughout the lifespan.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I'll add this anecdote and then, so I have had, because I think people will probably relate to this. This was before I knew I was autistic. I had friends that, for whatever reason, when I was in their presence, I would start getting kind of irritated at them. But then I knew I really liked them as humans, and over text, like I would be so much more expressive and like I really care about you. And I think that these confuse my friends because they're like, it's weird when I'm with you, I feel like you want to leave. But then you'll say you really care about me over text. And I think it gave a lot of kind of confusing social messages. What I now looking back, what I now realize is those were high sensory people, like either because maybe just energetically they were a lot to take in, or because maybe they wore cologne or perfume. And so I had no lens for understanding this. And so I just thought, I was like, why am I so like hot and cold in this friendship with this person? But looking back, it's like they were a great text-based friend. But whenever we were two bodies in a room together, I felt repelled because it was too much to take in. And so I thought about that with smell, because especially friends who have worn like cologne or perfume, I just can't tolerate to be around them.
Yeah.
But because I didn't realize that was going on, I just thought like, I'm not liking this moment of being with them, so I want to leave. And I misattributed it. I think that was the piece. I misattributed what I wasn't liking to like my feelings about the friendship. If that makes sense.
That's a great point.
Do you know what I mean when I say high sensory people?
Yeah, oh, totally.
Like a lot to take in.
Yeah, I mean, it could be energetically. It could be, like you said, it could be smell. It could be like someone who speaks really loud, really quickly, and takes up a lot of that space, both physiologically and just emotionally. I think that stuff is really tricky to navigate socially, because you're right. If you're not thinking about it from that perspective, you really do attribute it to more of a personality trait. And yeah, that can definitely feel misattuned when that communication, like you're like, oh, I really care about you. Text messaging is so easy. This is so enjoyable. And yeah, they can definitely receive that very differently.
Mm-hmm. This is why, like, I typically don't do well with in-person friendships with extroverts. And I'm so sorry if you're an extroverted person. This is not like I some of my like I really connect. I can connect well like over text or email, but it's that in person. There's actually some research about how extroverts and introverts take in sensory information differently. Like extroverts on average, like they get in more car accidents partly because it takes them longer to see the brake lights in front of them. So there tends to be a slower response to stimulus and they need more of it, whereas introverts tend to have sensitivity to stimulus. So one of my working theories is I think this is why like when I'm around an extrovert, I feel very overwhelmed very quickly. And I think it's partly because of how our systems are perceiving sensory stuff. And not all extroverts are high sensory people, but for me, a trend that I've noticed is most of the people in my life that I'm close to and connect most easily with are introverts.
Makes a lot of sense.
You're an introvert. Yeah. I don't even need to ask you.
Yeah,
Wait,
for
are
sure.
I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I have more of a need socially in some ways, but socializing for me needs to be like very specific, and it exhausts me unbelievably quickly.
yes, I think in our criteria, we covered that you have a much larger social motivation and
Yeah.
battery than me.
Yeah. And some of that is just some of that social motivation, going back to what I was just saying about like needing to dissociate from my body, is sensory driven, where it's like if I can be with someone else, right, and body double or just be in the same space as someone else, that can help co-regulate and allow me to move out of that sensory place where it's like, I'm so uncomfortable. I'm so uncomfortable. I'm so uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's only with select people. That's not with all people. That's like,
Right.
those have to be the right people.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, a couple more systems. So proprioception, and that's like knowing where our body is in space. So that's like I mentioned earlier, I like having weight on my lap. Those of us who like appreciate proprioceptive input tend to like pressure and weight and constriction. And again, you can be under or over responsive. So people who are under responsive tend to love, like as children, roughhouse play. They have a hard time knowing how much force they're using, so they
Right.
can accidentally hurt people. because they don't realize how much force they're doing. They might like have food on their face and not notice it. For proprioceptive sensitive folks, like again, one of my, again, I have one of each in my family. And when they were younger, if the sibling like just even walked by them, but didn't touch them, they thought they had been touched. Like that's how sensitive it was. Is sometimes you're not even touched, but it feels like you're being touched. So it's like extra sensitive input from that, like you feel with a lot of intensity. Yeah, that's my like. That's not that's not the most articulate I've described it before, but that's, yeah. Anything to add to proprioceptive?
No,
I mean,
think
you're
that's
a big athlete. I'm sure that's proprioception input is probably a big
yeah,
piece of that.
absolutely. And I think that's also a big sensory seeking need of mine, is that intensity seeking a piece of it. But no, I think it's a good like little summation. So the flip side of that, interoception.
Yeah, interoception. So that's knowing like inside our body. So the signals that are coming from inside. So things like hunger, thirst, the urge to use the bathroom. This is why potty training or toilet training is hard for a lot of kids. Emotions rely on interoception. So, whenever we talk about allistic, which I know we've done on here a few, that's like best seen under the umbrella of interoception, because it relies on that. So the ability, and this also, like, I hear it most often talked about in the autism community as low registration, but it can also be heightened registration. So you feel emotions with a lot of intensity, you feel pain with a lot of intensity. And there's also can be differentiation struggles. So it's like, is this anxiety, or is this a stomach pain, or is this hunger? And so differentiating the cues can also be more difficult. The studies that have looked at it, it's not that what's more common, not necessarily that the person's not experiencing stuff coming from the inside, but that it's not as accurate. So the way they measure this is like they put you up to a heart rate measurement, and they ask like how many heartbeats were in the last minute. And on average, autistic people tend to be off by more. The first time someone mentioned that other people could feel their heartbeat, I was like, what? Because I don't. Do you feel your, like, unless I'm like intense workout, I don't feel my heartbeat. Do you?
No, I would have to actively be like looking for it and trying to feel for it in order to be aware of it.
Even when if I just sit here and try to feel for it, I'd literally have to put my fingers to my wrist and feel the pulsing through.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's like I would have to check my pulse or check is it vibrating? But no, it's not something that I'm often aware of.
Yeah. So interoception, I think, is really interesting. Kelly Mailer has so many fantastic resources on this. I think I wish all therapists learned about this, because emotion regulation practices rely on interoceptive awareness.
Yep.
And so this is foundational to some of those higher level skills. And so I think a lot of times, if someone goes to therapy and they're like, it's not working and these skills aren't working, they can start feeling defeated about that. And it's often because these more foundational skills like interoceptive awareness haven't been built.
Yep.
Oh, I'm circling back. One of the reasons people sit weird, I don't know about you, but I'm always sitting in pretzel or stuffing. I want pressure on my body. That's because of proprioceptive, because we want the pressure. So if we sit cross-legged or just weird sitting positions, that's a common autistic and ADHD experience.
I'm often twisting my legs over themselves and doing this.
Yeah, you're giving yourself proprioceptive input.
Yeah, I need that pressure all the time.
Yeah, same. And then vestibular. So that has to do with balance and movement. And again, it can be really sensitive to it, high responder, under responder. People who have a heightened sensitivity to it get dizzy really easy, so they might get car sick easily. Things like elevators or escalators can be really uncomfortable. And it could show up as like anxiety. Like I remember as a kid, I had a lot of anxiety around escalators. I'm guessing it had to do with vestibular input, like as part of that. Or seeking, so someone who's like twirling all the time or swinging all the time or like just seeking that sensation.
Right.
That can be soothing for
And think about how often that's misdiagnosed, right? Like if you are struggling with vestibular, losing my words, if you were struggling with this and this vestibular sense, and you were nervous to get on an escalator, that could really be interpreted as like panic disorder, phobia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, you may go down like the ERP response or the OCD protocol or like something that was really off base if we're not aware of this in general.
Absolutely. I think especially with these, sometimes these are called like the hidden sensory systems, proprioceptive, interoception, and vestibular. Especially with these, like before diagnosing anxiety or panic, understanding like what is the sensory experience like behind this versus just like, is this some like a cognitive based anxiety about escalators are scary? I love that point. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Other sensory stuff we should talk about?
I think that's a good overview. I think also just you've mentioned this many times that, sensory is foundational. Like regulating our sensory system, we can't really do anything else in terms of regulation or navigation without regulating our sensory system. And I think that has to be paramount and at the forefront all the time.
Absolutely. Like, I don't feel like I have access to myself unless I'm sensory regulated.
Yeah.
Which I think that's part of why I know I joke a lot about not leaving the house, but like I have feelings about that. Like it's hard to have such a small life, but it's also hard to be out in the world and feel so utterly disconnected from my body and my experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. 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 I really I wouldn't choose to not be autistic, but like if you were like, hey, do you want a different sensory system? I'd be like, hell yeah, give me the pill.
Yeah. And listen, I think that's just vulnerable in naming that, but I also think that a lot of people listening are going to be like, yeah, absolutely. And I would agree with you 100%. I do think it's one of the most challenging things about my existence. It sounds like for you similarly. And I know that a lot of people feel very similar to that sentiment as well.
And I don't know if I feel pressure to like leave on a more positive note, but I do just want to mention that I've heard more people talk about like sensory pleasure and sensory delight. And I think that is the flip side of that for those of us with a heightened sensory experience. The pleasure that we get from sensory experiences can also be more intense. Like I think the pleasure I get from listening to music, I actually think it's more intense than what most people experience. And so, yeah, the flip side of this, or people that spend a lot of time in nature and how deeply connected they feel to nature, that's partly because of that more sensitive sensory system.
Yeah.
So there is a flip side to this. I think for me, I would still trade it in, even with the flip sides. But I just want to mention it's not all.
Yeah, no, that's a great reframe on that for sure. Like it doesn't lessen or negate the fact that it's unbelievably challenging, but it doesn't mean that it's also all pain and suffering and negativity either.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. One thing I do want to mention, because it's weird. I don't know if this is still circulating. I saw this circulating on social media a lot a couple years ago. Like whenever I'd post a Venn diagram and put sensory sensitivities in the middle, people would be like, no, it's not. That's autism. Like, you can't steal that from us. And it's like, autism does not have a monopoly on sensory sensitivities. I do think they tend to be more pervasive and like extreme, but people with PTSD have sensory sensitivities. ADHDers have sensory sensitivities. When you have an anxiety disorder, your sensory sensitivities go up. I mean, think about like your nervous system's more revved up, so your sensory system's going to be more revved up. So by no way, what am I trying to say? By no, I don't know, there's a sentence in there, but sensory does not, like, having sensory sensitivities does not equate autism. It just doesn't.
Right.
And I kind of present that idea is out there that anyone who has a sensory sensitivity therefore is autistic. That's just not true.
Yeah, that's probably a rabbit hole that I could go down right now, but I agree 100%. And another good point for sure. It is not an all or nothing concept.
Yeah. We can't monopolize traits as much as we might like to.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I hope that this series has been helpful. I think that it's a really great way to parse apart and have a better understanding of autistic experience and diagnostic criteria. And I think that the ADHD series will be really great too, especially because we don't talk about ADHD as often on here. So I'm looking forward to doing that. I know you love series and collections, so it's a win-win.
Thank you for going with my collection. And I think I feel more organized coming into this podcast. If it's like we're doing a mini series or collection, yeah, it just works better for my brain. When we do ADHD, maybe we should also touch on, like, I know we made some points when we went through this, but how autism criteria can look different when someone is ADHD dominant. That's getting super nuanced, but I mean, there's a lot of autistic ADHDers out there, and that can absolutely muddy the diagnostic picture on both accounts.
For sure. Absolutely. Well, I think we're at our end point, and yeah, my brain's now fried. So I think this is a good wrap up point, and we'll do our ADHD series next. And we've got a lot of good episodes in the pipeline. So looking forward to sharing those with y'all. And again, share feedback, questions, comments. We try to address what we can in the limited capacity that we have. And everyone listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast, we have new episodes on Fridays on all major platforms and YouTube. You can like, download, subscribe, and share. And goodbye.